just a little bit of history, and there are those in you in the room who probably fall in the same camp. When I first started in the venture capital world in the early 90s, I would go to cocktail receptions, not venture capital cocktail receptions, although that's part of the business of being a venture capitalist. And people would, you know, the usual chit-chat, what do you do, and all this stuff, and I'd say, well, I'm a venture capitalist, and I'd get this stare that like was, huh? You do, you know, well, it was like the conversation ended immediately because in the early 90s, the rest of the world didn't know what venture capital was and what venture capitalists were doing. It wasn't until the late 90s that I'd go to I changed my speech. I just said, I invest, you know, on behalf of a corporation, you know, and that was so boring it never led to any further dialogue. But when you got to the late 90s, there were actual venture capitalists on TV who were starring in fiction roles on TV. So at a point now where you can actually say that you're a venture capitalist, and pretty much everybody in the world knows who you are, what sort of business you're involved in, too. So here I am in Canada, and I have a few Canadian stories. The first of which I've shared with some of you in the room, and those were failed investments in Canada. But that's not a bad thing. For the company, it was obviously a bad thing. For the investor, it was a bad thing. But that's the business we're in. You know, we take risks, and not everything works. We've got to make sure some of them work. So I basically, in the early, I don't know when that was, about 10 years ago, I had 2 failed investments in Canada. And I basically stayed away from Canada for quite some time after that. So you're a little bruised, you know, et cetera. Had nothing to do with the fact that, that they were Canadian companies. But it did have to do with the venture capital environment in Canada. It was too changing. You never knew who was going to be representing your lead Canadian investor at the table. And they changed drastically. And they changed their ideas. You were a stepchild. You were an investor in a stepchild. And nobody looks as good as your own children. You know, the stepchildren never own up. You know, they're just never as good. And so that was the situation in both of those particular cases, where the lead Canadian investors act was not together, let's put it that way, to go for the long haul. And I hope you've changed that going forward, because it's critical to have continuity in these sorts of investments going forward. But I'll tell you, I'm back. My fund at Pfizer is now an investor in 2 Canadian companies. We're an investor in DVS here in Toronto, along with 5AM Partners. And we're also an investor in Equinox in Vancouver. So even though, you know, a little bit of hiccups in the beginning, I'm looking forward to phenomenal successes with these 2 businesses going forward. And know that it is a growth spurt, and it's a learning process that you have to go through to try to get it to work right for you as Canadian companies and for you as Canadian investors, too.